Okay, let's continue our quest to answer the question, how did we end up with only 27 books of the New Testament? As we looked at evidence so far, we're starting to see that it was a decision made by the majority of Christians in the first, second, and third centuries. However, what we need to know are the details of why and how they made that decision. And last week we got a little taste of how by a second century Christian named Serapion, who he dealt with that book that claimed to be written by Peter. Remember, it was called the Gospel of Peter. And we learned that he was able to trace the origin of that book all the way back to a sect called the Ascete. It was a sect of Gnostics. They fabricated the book. Um, and so tonight we want to take it a little further and look at another well-known Christian named Tertullian. Now, Tertullian, he was an apologist who lived in northern Africa, in Carthage, from 155 to 220 A.D. And he wrote a lot of books. He wrote a five-volume set called Adversus Marcionum, which I may have mentioned before. Translated, it simply means against Marcion. This was a major issue for Christians in the second century because Marcion was a strong advocate against what the apostles wrote. I mean, think about that. Here's a guy who strongly disagrees with apostolic teaching. One of the things he did was he mutilated Luke's gospel. And so, what Tertullian is doing, he's making a major defense of the gospel of Luke, particularly in volumes 4 or 5 of his 5 book set. But he's not only defending Luke's gospel, he's defending all of the apostolic writings. First of all, Marcion, he hated the Jews, and as a result, he flat out rejected the Old Testament, and he rejected any parts of the apostolic writings which disagreed with him. What he was claiming was that, wow, those letters, those written by the letter, they were not scripture at all. In other words, they were not inspired by God. That's what he's saying. And so he wanted to eliminate them from everybody's reading list. And as you recall, the early churches, they had started their reading lists. And so in volumes 1 and 2 of Tertullian's books, he refutes Marcion's dualism. What he means by that is that Marcion claimed that there was a lesser God of the Old Testament and the superior God over the New Covenant. In volume 3, Tertullian talks about how Jesus is the Messiah of the Old Testament. And then in volumes 4 and 5, he discusses how Marcion butchers both the Gospel of Luke and the letters that Paul wrote. And it's Marcion's Gospel that Tertullian is refuting in those 2 volumes. The way Marcion mutilated the Gospel of Luke was by just throwing out whatever he didn't like or something that didn't fit his ideas, about the about the Apostle of Paul. And so we learn a number of things, interesting things, in these documents, written not only by Christians, but also written by Gnostics. For example, Marcion had a major disagreement with what Paul wrote. But what does that have to do with destroying the Gospel of Luke? I mean, why discredit Luke's account? Because you got a disagreement with Paul. And this is what I mean when I say we learn some interesting things from all of this. Because of his major disagreements with Paul, this tells us that Marcion, as well as all the other early Christians, knew that Paul was behind, or at least very supportive of what Luke wrote. And we'll talk more about that later on. But what's important for us right now is that Tertullian is refuting this Gnostic Marcion. Now, to be clear, Marcion condemned and he rejected all of the apostles, not just Paul. He believed that they got everything wrong and they changed and they corrupted everything, the things that they wrote. And so Marcion rejected the Gospels written by Matthew, Mark, and John. And he only accepted certain parts of the Gospel of Luke. Concerning what Paul wrote, he acknowledged 10 of Paul's letters. But even within those letters, Marcion, he deleted things that he didn't like, just like he did with the Gospel of Luke. I mean, this is an amazing war that was going on in the middle of the second century. I mean, it was a major battle over things that were written and things that are being written. And it's a battle that most people are not aware of, but we are. because we're going to look at what Tertullian has documented about these very things. And this gives us insight on how Orthodox and, in other words, genuine Christians dealt with these issues. Okay, let's read a quote from Tertullian. On the whole, then, if that is evidently more true, which is from the very beginning, which has the apostles for its authors, then it will certainly be quite as evident that that comes down from the apostles, which has been kept as a sacred deposit in the churches of the apostles. Let us see what milk the Corinthians drank from Paul, and to what rule of faith the Galatians were brought for correction. So according to Tertullian, if you want to know the truth, where do you go? To the beginning, where everything starts. And who is there in the beginning? The apostles. And in this case, the apostolic works, their writings. So by late 2nd century, if you want to know the truth about Jesus Christ, you go to what was written by the apostles. Let's read let me repeat what he wrote. Then it will certainly be quite as evident that that comes down from the apostles, which has been kept as a sacred deposit in the churches of the apostles. Let us see what milk the Corinthians drank from Paul, to what rule of faith the Galatians were brought for correction. So if you want to know the content of the letter written to the Corinthians, or the letter written to the Galatians, and you don't have a copy of it, where would you go? You go to Corinth, or you go to Galatia, where those letters were kept and guarded. That term there, rule of faith, that's a technical phrase, and he's referring to Paul's letters and his oral tradition that they relied upon so heavily. And so when Paul was writing Galatians, he was correcting them by that rule of faith. He goes on to say, what the Philippians, the Thessalonians, the Ephesians read by it, what utterance also the Romans give. We also have St. John's Foster churches. For although Marcion rejects his apocalypse, the orders of the bishops thereof, when traced up to their origin, will yet rest on John as their author. In the same manner is recognized the excellent source of the other churches. And so he says, go to the beginning, go to the writings of the apostles. And how would they do that? Notice he says the churches. You go to the churches that he's listing here: Corinthians, Philippians, Thessalonians, Ephesians, Romans. And we know of these churches, right? We don't we? And he also mentions the churches where John wrote his letters from. Well, we don't know which churches they were, though. But those Christians did. Those early Christians that Tertullian's writing to, he knew that they knew John's foster churches. He says, go to the churches that are housing his letters, and you can trace their origin right back to John as their author. Okay, so let's walk through this as an exercise. We're living in the late 2nd century. Let's just imagine. And we want to take Tertullian's advice, to confirm Paul's first letter that he wrote to the Corinthians. How would we know that this letter, which is housed in Corinth, is indeed genuine? That it was actually written by the Apostle Paul? How do we know that the church in Corinth didn't make it up, that they didn't fabricate it themselves and just put Paul's name on it? How would we know if John's letters, including Revelation, were authored by him? How do we know that one of those churches didn't invent it and just put John's name on it? We'd find out by asking to see the orders of the bishops of that church. In other words, we'd ask for their records of particular documents which they were keeping. If there were no records that were kept from previous years, that records regarding a particular document, then it was most likely a fake. Notice what Tertullian said here, referring to John's book of Revelation. For although Marcion rejects his apocalypse, the orders of the bishops thereof, when traced up to their origin, will yet rest on John as their author. You see, what you have here, you have bishops, in other words, elders of a particular church. And let's start with the elders who are living in the first century. What what they were doing. What were they doing? Well, they were writing down and they recorded what they know about John and about the church, their church. And they start off by saying, for example, well, here's the Apostle John. We know John and we know what John wrote. And then those bishops, which are immediately appointed next after them, they say, yes, we know the Apostle John, and we know that the Apostle John wrote the Apocalypse. And then the next set of bishop or the next bishop after him, he writes down and he starts recording, makes his records, and he says, yes, I'm the bishop after that previous bishop, and here's the records that I received. Here's what practices we do based on the original letters or letter we have. And we know who wrote it, and so on and so forth. And so, if you're living at the end of the 2nd century, you have this chain of witnesses which can be traced to those archives, those historical archives. And since you have that chain, then it wouldn't be too difficult to trace any letter, any book, back to the apostolic time of the 1st century. You remember that's exactly what Serapion did with the fake invented Gospel of Peter that we talked about last time. There were no records kept of that gospel. On the other hand, let's say a few Christians of the 2nd century, we're talking 2nd century, they're living in Corinth, and they fabricate and they make up this letter themselves, and they call it 1st Corinthians. In other words, these 2nd century Christians, they make up the story that their church received this letter from Paul when he was alive back in the 1st century. So here we are living in the middle of the 2nd century, and we see their letter. Okay, but you also have other records of bishops that belong to the 1st century. And those earlier bishops don't mention anything in their records about this amazing letter, the letter called 1st Corinthians. And then none of the succeeding bishops after them record anything about this letter. I mean, that would immediately raise a question. How could no one have mentioned this letter early on? How could those early Christians in the 1st century not know that they have something this special? The church in Corinth says they have this letter, but no one else. No, there's nothing there. Especially when all the churches know letters are like this. There's something special. They need to hold on to them. I mean, think about all those churches that were actually started by the apostles themselves. And those churches, they were still alive in the 2nd century. Their archives, they were still available. Everyone could go there. Everyone could be capable to trace and investigate the truth. In other words, the written word, all the way back to its origin, just like Serapion did with the Gospel of Peter. Okay, so let's continue with Tertullian's quote. I say, therefore, that in them and in all those which are united with them in the fellowship, that gospel of Luke, which we are defending with all our might, has stood its ground from its very first publication, whereas Marcion's gospel is not known to most people, and to none, wherever it is known, without being at the same time condemned. Marcion's gospel contains parts of the Gospel of Luke because he only cut out what he didn't like. And yet people were able to recognize the difference. They know that the Gospel of Luke was written in the 1st century because he said it stood its ground from its very first publication. And they can figure out the content, whether it is the same as it was in the beginning or if it was altered or changed as it was in the case of Marcion's Gospel. On the other hand, Marcion's Gospel is not known to most people. And also notice that most places, even where it was known, people were condemning it. And he goes on, the same authority of the apostolic churches will afford evidence to the other gospels also. I mean the gospels of John and Matthew, whilst that which Mark published may be affirmed to be Peter's, whose interpreter Mark was. For even Luke's form of the gospel men usually ascribe to Paul, and it may well seem that the works which disciples published belong to their masters. So the Gospels of John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're all present right here in one listing. And Tertullian claims that all of them are of the same authority. The apostolic authority is behind all of them, and they can be traced in the very same way as the Gospel of Luke can be traced. Well, then, Marcion ought to be called to a strict account concerning these other Gospels also, for having omitted them and insisted in preference on Luke, as if they too had not had free course in the churches, as well as Luke's Gospel from the beginning. So Tertullian is acknowledging that Marcion had the Gospel of Luke just like everybody else. And he contrasts the Gospel of Luke with the Gospel of Marcion. He acknowledges that what Marcion has is mostly the Gospel of Luke, but he also acknowledges that the four Gospels had free course. And there was free reign in all the churches, and they had them from the beginning, meaning the 1st century. What Tertullian is saying is that it's very easy to identify what are true, genuine apostolic documents and what is the content of those apostolic documents. You just go to the source. You just read the sacred deposit. You learn from the originals that the apostolic churches treasured and kept. That's it. Then guys like Marcion can't mislead you if you don't want to be misled. And notice something else. Tertullian is not condemning Marcion for going against any human authority. He's not saying Marcion is wrong because we have a big guy up there in church headquarters who decides for us what is the truth, what is not the truth, or which book is to be read and which book is not to be read, which one has to be rejected. He's not saying, Marcion, you are not submissive and that's why you're wrong. No, he condemns Marcion for going against the truth. Here's how the truth can be established. Here's how the writings we possess, Tertullian said, can be demonstrated and verified as apostolic from the beginning. You, Marcion, are a liar, and here's the evidence to prove it. And so the content of what Tertullian wrote in his battle with Marcion testifies, and it shows that the methods, the mechanisms were available to everyone, to anyone, and they were used by many Christians. And those mechanisms were very simple. You don't have to be a scholar to know that it works. You just go there and you trace it, and that's it. So we're looking at the mechanism which actually existed at the end of the 2nd century. They had the books that were physically available to Christians at that time, the writings of the apostles that can be easily identified in the very churches which were established by them. Each book can be traced back to the time of its origin and down to the place it was written or who it was sent to. This is what they had available when they were deciding which book to be accepted and which book to be rejected. These books were treasured and they were used by corresponding churches from the beginning. Any new oral tradition or doctrine, it couldn't be invented later because it was confirmed by unbroken successions or independent bishops, records throughout the region. Let's read more of his quote. Come now, you who would indulge a better curiosity, if you would apply it to the business of your salvation, run over the apostolic churches in which the very thrones of the apostles are still preeminent in their places. The business of your salvation, he calls it. If you're concerned about your salvation, then you need to go and consult those authentic writings. You need to consult the apostles through what they wrote. And then he goes on, in which their own authentic writings are read, uttering the voice and representing the face of each of them severally. Achaia is very near you, in which you find Corinth. And where should one go? And this sentence here, Achaia, it's close to you. That's where Corinth is. Since you are not far from Macedonia, you have Philippi. And there too you have the Thessalonians. Since you are able to across to Asia, you get Ephesus. Since, moreover, you are close upon Italy, you have Rome, from which there comes even into our own hands the very authority of the apostles themselves. He's saying these are the actual churches that we know received Paul's letters. You can go there. You can read those letters for yourself. Confirm the historic records about them. And so the bottom line is that the early Christians had powerful methods of historical investigation that could be used for establishing authenticity of any book. There can be no doubts about that. And they knew that it was a matter of salvation to know the authorized writings. By accepting those books was the same thing as accepting the Lord himself. And they also knew that not every book which claimed apostolic origin was apostolic. That's why they were very careful to conduct their investigations. But at the same time, when you look at Marcion and other Gnostics, you see that they're the guys who tried to mislead people by introducing or inventing new ideas, as if those ideas were coming from either the Apostle Paul, like Marcion tried to do, or coming from the Apostle Peter, as the Sete Gnostics tried to claim. And as a result, you had to be very careful. I mean, if you made a small mistake, in the end, you could be led away from the truth. That's why the majority was so meticulous with those apocryphal writings. Those documents, they had no chance of surviving. The Christians of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, they knew that their salvation depended on the genuineness of the apostolic writings. And they had powerful historical means for establishing authenticity of any book, tools and methods that we ourselves, we don't have at our disposal. The history of the Apocrypha, the how and the why those books were universally rejected, it demonstrates the effectiveness of those tools, those mechanisms that they had. And at the same time, the rejection of those three Orthodox books that we talked about, First Clement, Barnabas, and the Shepherd, that proves the objectivity of those Christians who used those books. So let's make some conclusions from what we know so far up to this point, from everything we discussed from the beginning of our study. The preaching of the Gospels, oral or written, it contained the wisdom and the power of God, the commandments of Jesus Christ. And Paul said that his message, it was the same for everybody in all the places. Nothing changes, what he said. Throughout all the churches in the 1st and 2nd centuries, it was the same message. And continuing right up to our time in the 21st century. Starting from apostolic times, salvation depended on strict obedience to the gospel as it was preached orally in the beginning. The Christians, during the apostolic age, they understood very well the divine authority behind the apostolic preaching. And as the letters by the apostles, they started coming in, appearing on the scene, they submitted themselves to those writings and regarded them as equal and, in fact, superior to the Old Testament scriptures. And tonight we saw that they had powerful resources and historical tools or mechanisms for establishing authenticity of any apostolic book. And because their salvation depended upon those books, they used all the resources and mechanisms that they had. And so with all these facts and the historical data, we have all the reason in the world to agree with the decision of the early church to discard and reject those apocrypha books from the list. In other words, there's no reason for us 2,000 years later, after the fact, to even consider the apocrypha as being inspired writings. Especially when you hear critics today who look at those rejected books and they try to tell us that, well, we need to read them or consider them, think of them as legitimate. I'd ask them, why? Why would we consider them as inspired? I mean, what evidence can you show for that? There is none. None at all. And so this concludes then category 3 of the 3 major groups, the books which were generally rejected by the masses, consisting of both orthodox and apocryphal writings. And if you remember, we're working our way backwards. We started with 3, and next week we're going to now look at group number 2, those 7 books that are listed in that category, which at one time were actually disputed and rejected, but then eventually accepted into the canon. I mean, this is equally important for us to learn how and why and what battles were fought over these particular books. So I want to thank you for being here again tonight, and I look forward to our next session together, which will be lesson number 6.